Welcome and thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm Doug Davis, a representative of Move to Amend, South Central Indiana. And after Jeff's talk today, if you're interested, we have brochures up here and a sign-up sheet and also a donation envelope, believe it or not. So if you want to give a little money, that'd be great. Our guest visit today is very timely. We have just witnessed the results of a gluttony of spending and influence peddling to the tune of almost $4 billion this last election. And that's $40 million more than was in 2010. And it does not include money on so-called issue ads. So we've seen a lot of money being spent. Jeff Clements is in the forefront of those working to overturn the disastrous and anti-democratic decision in Citizens United by the Supreme Court. He's been an assistant attorney general in Massachusetts and is co-founder and current chair of the board of Free Speech for People, a national nonpartisan organization working to overcome Citizens United. We're pleased Jeff and his wife Nancy have come here today to speak to us and sign his book. So please give Jeff a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks to Move to Amend here in Bloomington, but also all over the country. There's chapters of Move to Amend and doing great work in cities and towns all over the country, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you haven't had a chance to check out, there we go. I'm just going to tumble right out. If you haven't had a chance to check out the debate with David Cobb and Jim Bopp, David Cobb is one of the co-founders of Move to Amend, and Jim Bopp, as you probably know, is one of the architects of the dismantling of our campaign finance system, the lawyer who represented Citizens United and others in challenging McCain-Feingold and the campaign finance laws. It's on YouTube. I'm sure you can find it. It's an excellent debate, and I think as elsewhere in the country, except on the Supreme Court, the side of the people is very clear that David's argument is the better argument in terms of how we preserve democracy in this country. So check it out. But I think it was right here, Doug, wasn't it, in
Yes.
Bloomington? Not here in Barnes and Noble, but over at the law school. If I'm pointing the right way. But, so that way. Thank you. What I thought I'd do today, in just chatting a little bit about the new book, because some of my friends say, when we started this tour this time around about a month ago, we started in the Concord Bookshop, where I'm from, and my friends would say, didn't the book just come out? Why do we have to buy it again? And someone had the first edition back there. There's the first edition. So it's a nicer color, it looks better, but that's not the only reason. The answer is yes, you have to buy it again. And the answer isn't because Nancy and I have 3 kids in college, because we're giving all the royalties away to groups like Move to Amend, Free Speech for People, and others, 100% for the cause. The real reason you have to buy it again is what has happened these past 3 to 4 years since the first edition was written. I wrote the book after doing a brief in the Citizens United case, after a career at the Attorney General's office and in private practice, where I saw corporations and big money, whether corporate money, union money, billionaire money, slowly just shrinking the space for democracy, for we the people to have a voice. And I wanted to at first understand, how did this happen? I mean, like a lot of us, I think, right? How did this happen in our country? What do we do about it? Those are some of the questions I wanted to answer. So the first edition was really mostly on how did it happen, and some on what we can do about it, but it was more predictive about what might happen now that the Supreme Court and Citizens United, the decision, wiped out the McCain-Feingold law, said we the people are not allowed, literally, we're not allowed to enact laws to limit campaign spending in elections. The law had applied to unions and corporations, said no, we're not allowed to limit that. We're not allowed to limit billionaire spending in elections, basically dismantling our voices. So to understand how that happened is what the book is about. But now I can say, after 3 years and the new edition, there's a much more hopeful second part of the book, which is that Americans know the problem. You don't have to convince a lot of people. If you're having conversations about big money ruining our democracy, and if we ruin our democracy, we ruin our country, we lose the middle class, we lose, safe drinking water, clean air, we lose good schools, we lose everything that we've worked hard for across partisan lines. It doesn't matter, this isn't about partisan politics. We lose everything, and we lose what we promised as a country. And I think many, many Americans know that that's the state we're in now, where, despite all the advertisements last Tuesday and all the, noise about the election, I think most Americans get that what we saw the last few months in this election isn't about a vibrant democracy of the people. I think everybody, at least I hope everybody voted, but in a kind of weary, hopeless sort of way. And what I'm finding though is people aren't hopeless. They're not filled with hope from politicians anymore. They're not going to save us. It's certainly not hope from the Supreme Court. Nothing coming there. But what we're seeing is what we've seen in America since the beginning of our country. When things get really bad, and we realize there's no one to save us, it's up to us. We do it, and that's what's happening now. And that's also in the book. And there's a whole new chapter called "Do Something" that allows you to kind of plug in to many different ways you can do something. So I'll get to that, but let me first recap for you, even though you probably don't need it, why we need to do something, why you're maybe in here on a nice, lovely Sunday afternoon when you might rather be doing something else. Why do we need to do all this hard work that people are doing all over the country? Well, I said it's a crisis of democracy, and it is. And I'd like to sort of outline precisely what I mean by that, because I think, I've talked to some folks here already about just how hard it is to reach across partisan lines, Republicans, Democrats. How do we get together on this? Because when people vote to overturn Citizens United, it's not partisan, it's not close. It's a city after city, state after state, 75, 25, 70, 30. But to actually work together across Republican and Democrat lines is hard. And I think it's helpful if we, and I tried to do this in the book, show just how nonpartisan this is. And that doesn't mean kind of in the middle. The crisis is nonpartisan. Republican children and Democratic children are going to grow up in America that's not what we want if we don't do something. And so the way I look at it is there's the money problem. Unlimited campaign spending is one issue. And there's what I call the corporate veto in the courts, because the court has created a new thing, constitutional rights for corporations, that's been used to strike down even the most modest laws. So let me say what I mean by that. The money crisis in America for our democracy comes not just from the amount. Doug mentioned $4 billion in a midterm election. That's unheard of. That's a record. It's about $30 billion now since Citizens United was decided in 2010 and the campaign finance laws were knocked down. And that's a lot of money, but that's not really what the issue is. It is part of the issue, but the real issue is where the money comes from. And I don't mean like an ideological source or a partisan source or even a corporate source versus a union source. I mean from how few sources it comes from. So let's look at some numbers. In 2012, we now have some data. There's always a lot of lag time, and there's data we'll never know because there's so much secret money, the so-called dark money, running into the system. I think it's something like 40% in this election last Tuesday of the money, that $4 billion, can't be traced to where it came from because it's run through nonprofit so-called front groups. But what we do know, 2012, that's when we saw the super PAC phenomenon. Another reason we needed the new edition of the book. When I first wrote it, the 2012 election hadn't happened. We didn't have super PACs. We didn't know exactly what was happening. Now we know. So of that super PAC money that funded so much of the constant 24-hour, 7 days a week attack ads in 2012, 32 donors, that's 32, literally, 32 donors contributed more than all of the donors to both the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign, who gave $200 or less combined. So that added up to hundreds of millions of dollars of so-called small donors, normal, regular people who send, you know, a check for 100 or 200 bucks to Obama's campaign or Romney's campaign. And not even most Americans don't do that. I mean, that's about, you know, less than 5% of Americans give any money at all to campaigns. So we're already talking about a really small pool. So all of that was exceeded, wiped out by just 32 donors to super PACs. Another way to look at it is almost all the super PAC money, well over 90%, came from 3,300 donors. So if you do the math, that's less than a fraction of 1%, right? In a country of 330 million people. So it's very few people, very few sources for a huge amount of money. So what that does is a number of things. It of course makes the politicians dance to the tune of where the money's coming from, or just be afraid to dance at all because they don't want to, generate. They don't want to, when I say dance, afraid to tackle a big problem or introduce a bill or work for something the country needs because of the attack ad and the money that will come against them. So they don't do that. They don't want to get those 32 donors mad at them. And of course, it excludes almost everybody. My colleague at Free Speech for People, John Boniface, calls this the wealth primary, similar to what was ruled unconstitutional long ago, the so-called white primary, where in Texas, back in the Jim Crow days, they would have an unofficial whites-only primary, and then they'd have the candidates, and then we'll have the election. But the candidates had already been picked to make sure African Americans would not be represented and would not have a candidate and would not have a vote. That was what's called the white primary, finally struck down by the Supreme Court. John Boniface says this is like the wealth primary, where almost all Americans are excluded, and then we get to go and pull a lever on November 4th. But it's already been decided in the white primary what issues are we going to talk about. More importantly, what are we not going to talk about? Whether it's climate catastrophe or anything else. What candidates are so-called viable, right? Viable means the ones who are able to please some of those small number of donors into this system. So it excludes people, and we get this vicious circle of more money from fewer sources. Not only do people say, well, why send my $100 in? If Sheldon Adelson could put $93 million in, what's my $100? So people don't participate that way. But more importantly, they don't participate even to vote. So voting rates are going down. They don't participate in even citizens gatherings like this or any other. Just basic citizenship being eroded, and then more money coming in this vicious circle. So I mentioned Sheldon Adelson. I don't want to pick on any one funder because they're on both sides, Democrat, Republican. But let me just use Sheldon Adelson as an example of casino mogul, global casinos in Macau, all over the world. I said he spent $93 million, right? So, and that was in 2012. He is back this year with his checkbook, and he has been indicating he's going to spend as much or more in 2016. So sure enough, the candidates who might run for president are going to essentially audition to this billionaire. And so Molly Ball in the Atlantic magazine was at one of these auditions, these so-called conferences with Sheldon Adelson and some candidates, would-be candidates, potential candidates for president in 2016. She described it in the Atlantic as the Sheldon Adelson suck-up fest, in which the candidates, like daughters of King Lear or the cast of Mean Girls, each sought to outdo the others in his fawning. That's what we've come to. And as the president of, what is the greatest nation in the world and should be and could be again, is sort of humiliating themselves and us by this kind of performance in front of billionaires because they feel they have to. That's what's happening. Corporations, sometimes you heard after Citizens United, and so the new additions needed for this. Well, look, corporations really aren't spending much money. It's not, they know that Americans get mad when corporations spend money in elections, and we do. So there's, Target spent money in Minnesota and tried to help get a governor elected. People got really mad. There's a boycott of Target all over the country. Great response, actually. Target apologized, said we won't do that anymore. So then there was this sort of myth, and I'll tell you why it's a myth, that corporations aren't spending money in elections because they don't want to anger their customers. Well, a couple of weeks ago at the Republican Governors Association, and again, I'm not picking on the Republicans because this could have happened at the Democratic Governors Association, I guarantee you. It's one of those front groups. And I say that because they spend a lot of money in elections. So where do they get their money? Well, the Republican Governors Association staff, somebody did a coding error so that documents, which are usually secret, ended up on the public website. So that these documents are now public, and it read like the Fortune 500 with their shopping list, essentially. Millions and millions of dollars from some of the biggest corporations in the world, and you know them all, Pfizer, Walmart, Microsoft, you name it. They were on this list, and the millions they had given into the Republican Governors Association, the access that got them, and how that money is then used, just made probably in Indiana, all over the country, spent, and as I said, I'm quite certain the Democratic Governors Association has a similar document. Maybe they have better coders, but it's, we haven't seen the document yet, but it's a similar practice. U.S. Chamber of Commerce is another one where the corporations are putting millions and millions of dollars into our elections, and they just don't, we do get mad. Americans do get mad when it happens, so they're trying to hide it. Some of them don't try to hide it. The fossil fuel corporations know that they're not very popular, so they just do it. Chevron just writes big checks. Chevron spent $3 million in a city council race of 100,000 people, a town of 100,000 people, Richmond, California, $3 million. The good news is, when a town is that small, people know what's up. TV doesn't work because neighbors are talking to each other. Every Chevron candidate lost. And yeah, so we can push back against this. So that's the problem. It's the money, but it's more importantly the source of the money is so small, in such huge magnitude, that it ends up being, and I'll use the word, plutocracy, government of, for, and by the wealthy or the corporations. And for a while, I know Bloomington is not the most conservative part of Indiana. But I thought, coming into Indiana, can you say words like plutocracy? It's kind of a conservative, down to earth kind of place. But that's true everywhere in America. My wife Nancy grew up in Maine. We go back all the time. Central Maine, North Central Maine, probably a lot like areas of Bangor. Lots of other areas of Maine are conservative. They vote Republican. They just elected a Republican congressman up there in the 2nd district. And Governor LePage, a Republican, won again. So I was speaking in Central Maine a few weeks ago and thinking, like I said, should I use words like plutocracy? And I don't want to, and I think it not because I want to say different things in different places, just I want to have a conversation with people, and vocabulary matters to have a conversation instead of just like, and so I was thinking about that, and I opened up the newspaper that morning, and the talk was at night, and it was the Kennebec Journal, an old newspaper. It's been around Maine for 100 years probably, out of Augusta and Kennebec Valley area. And I'm looking in the Kennebec Journal just to get the local flavor and catch up on news up there. And I come across their editorial, not an op-ed, their actual editorial of the Kennebec Journal, conservative newspaper, and they write the following that day. This is their editorial page. Government cannot be expected to work for people with this level of campaign spending done by only a few. As income inequality expands, the people who benefit the most from current economic policies are also the ones with outsized influence on those policies. And then the Kennebec Journal said this: there is a name for government by the rich, plutocracy. So this is, and they say, and it's not what our founding fathers were trying to create when they guaranteed our freedom of speech. So I think this is something anywhere in the country, Americans get it. Plutocracy means government of the rich. It's not a inflammatory insult. It's not something we want. It's not a criticism of Americans. It's a criticism of the system, whether it's being able to participate in our election system fairly and on an equal basis, or when we're told we're not allowed to make fair election laws to get a handle on this system because supposedly that violates free speech rights of corporations and billionaires. The money is just like, you know, now even citizenship and self-government are sort of commodified into something you buy. You know, that's plutocracy, the result, not the people, the result. So this appalling thing, a few more appalling things, and I'm going to get to some good news, don't worry. But the problem is, this is actually being defended now. You know, look, if we were looking at a country on the other side of the world that called themselves a democracy, and their system was funded by a few families, a few corporations, and a few billionaires, we would say, no, you're not a democracy, right? So, unfortunately, we now have political scientists confirming this. So there's a study out of Northwestern and Princeton, just out. It's called The Influence of Affluence. Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. Most comprehensive look at the data set for how policy in America is actually influenced and created. And their conclusion is this, and I'm quoting again, the estimated impact of average citizens' preferences is at a non-significant, near zero level. Ordinary citizens have little or no independent influence on policy at all. Economic elites and organized business interests have substantial independent impact on U.S. government policy. So they're not just like claiming this or making a slogan. This is a result of looking at how policy is actually influenced. And you know, I said people defend policy, the plutocracy. In response, the Manhattan Institute, one of these big, extremely well-funded kind of groups, says this is no news, no big deal, that rich people vote more often, that they are better informed, and they kind of represent the interests of the middle class anyway. So it doesn't matter if rich people are running the country and everyone else isn't. So if that's the kind of defense we're asked to live with, I think we're in real trouble. We're basically being told, well, plutocracy kind of works okay, so don't worry about it. I don't think Americans want to do that. So the problem that the new edition is trying to show is again something about the effects of the Citizens United decision, rather than the legal arguments and all that. It's, you know, just objectively, what is the result? We can see it now around us, and it's how republics have always failed. I mean, this is a textbook sort of systems theory result. It's a textbook example of what James Madison called faction, of what the founders of the country are trying to put together. All the checks and balances of the Constitution knew destroys republics, destroys democracy. When you have organized faction and a system that just keeps rewarding the source of the faction, in this case money power, you essentially are on a path straight to the destruction of a republic. And that's what we're well into, unfortunately. And that's not even all. I said about the corporate veto. So Free Speech for People, we're working on some solutions, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And that's when the clouds are going to lift and the sun is going to shine. Because corporations are people. Right? It's not all about money. So we are in litigation. We're working on solutions, including a constitutional amendment campaign, which I'm about to talk about. But we also fight in the courts, because how we got here was an organized, very well-funded effort to use what Lewis Powell, who I talk about in my book, and we can talk more about him later, but talked about using activist-minded Supreme Court justices and massive amounts of corporate money to transform our Constitution and our system. That's what we're living with now, so we have to push back in the courts too. That's what we're doing. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of what we are seeing in the courts since Citizens United. Employees' rights to be informed of the law and to talk about workplace conditions so they could decide whether to organize or not, struck down. Violation of corporate constitutional rights not to speak, not to be required to inform employees of their rights. You know, all of us have been in workplaces. You know those workplace notices you see about our rights as employees. violation of the Constitution now in this brave new world. Country of origin labeling. You want to support American farmers, you want to buy American beef in your hamburger or whatever, there's a law, used to be, that said the meat had to be labeled for where it came from. Struck down. Violation of corporate rights. So over and over we're seeing this, and I could give a lot of other examples, but I want to just give two more. In St. Louis, we're in a case where Peabody Energy is the big local, one of the big local, they're not local, they're global, but they have a big base in St. Louis. Peabody Energy gets a lot of tax subsidies from St. Louis taxpayers. Well, 30,000 St. Louis taxpayers said, you know, we want to reevaluate this and see if we can get a more resilient economy, not just keep paying a big global corporation and hope that they'll stay and maybe give us a job or two. We want to use that money to improve schools, build roads, things like that. So they got on the ballot, 30,000 signed a ballot initiative in St. Louis to vote on their tax money, whether it should continue to be going to Peabody Energy and fossil fuel corporations. Well, they weren't allowed to vote. The vote was blocked, a violation of so-called equal protection rights of corporations and First Amendment rights of corporations. And not only that, the corporate lobbyists went to the Missouri legislature and got the law changed. And it's such a special law, classic illustration of what corruption is. If one interest, one company can get a law that's just for them, that's what happened. The Missouri legislature passed a law saying St. Louis citizens are not allowed to have a ballot initiative that involves tax subsidies to fossil fuel corporations. That's what it said, essentially. So they did the 1-2 punch, corporate veto in the courts, plus money corruption of legislators to basically disable even the right to vote about their own tax dollars being used. The other example, just to show how extreme this is getting, in Seattle voters voted to lift minimum wage to $15 an hour over time. You know, one of the problems of the loss of democracy is wages are going down. We're just like everywhere else in the world now, where, you know, global corporations can just drive wages down. And so there's the Seattle residents, you know, finally giving up on politicians doing this, said we're going to do it ourselves. They voted, raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It was phased in over time to give business, small business and others, a chance to work and accommodate this new law. Well, it was challenged in court. We're in the court fighting. We're helping to defend the case. But the challenge is that the minimum wage violates corporate constitutional rights, violates corporate free speech rights, and corporate so-called equal protection rights under the 14th Amendment. That's the corporate veto. Even if we get a law, even if we come together and we try to, you know, get a law on the books through our own ballot initiative process, vetoed in the courts, just like in Citizens United. So that's what we have to fix. We have to fix this. Or, you know, we have to, I think, dedicate everything we can in our lifetimes, because it's going to take, it's not going to be easy. I didn't come here, there's a chapter that says do something with lots of great solutions. They're all hard, right? So just so you know, in case you think you're going to spend whatever it costs to get the magic solution, there is no magic solution. But there are a lot of good ideas, and more importantly, they're examples that they inspired me. They're Americans who never did political stuff, who, you know, are now doing things. And so I tell their stories because it inspires me. I think it'll inspire you. And here's what we need to do, in my view. And we need to give it everything we got, because this is, as I said, I think one of the biggest crises of our country in our lifetimes. We need to overturn Citizens United. That case cannot stand. It's against the basic American principle of one person, one vote, of political equality. We may not be equal in all kinds of ways, but the promise that we've always made since, you know, the North Bridge back in Concord, where we're from, is we come to this as equals, as citizens, right? As citizens, we are equal. That's why we get to vote equally. That's why we have a representative, equal representation. So Citizens United says, no, we're not equal, actually. And I'm going to get back to why we need to overturn it, but I just want to, I'm not exaggerating when I say that they say we are not politically equal. This is the winning argument from the brief in the McCutcheon case. McCutcheon is a case that came right after Citizens United, a year or two after. That's why we needed a new edition too. It struck down another law a campaign finance law that said in the aggregate, you can't give more than $123,000 to federal candidates for office in a year. So all of you who have been waiting to give $3 million to federal politicians, you are now free to do so, thanks to the Supreme Court. Right? Think about that. That's 5 times almost the median earnings of Americans. You know, we often hear $50,000 median household income. That's usually 2 earners. Right? It's closer to $26,000. So here we have a limit that is 5 times what people earn in a year, and that's ruled unconstitutional, that we're not allowed to have that limit. But here's the winning argument. Contribution limits may not be upheld as a means of limiting disparities in the extent to which people of different economic backgrounds are able to participate in the political process. Think about that. They say out loud, and it wins, that we are not allowed to have laws intended to enable people of different economic backgrounds to participate in the political process. I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting. That's what they say, that won. So we are in a fight for basic American principles. They're wrong. I hope you're all with me, but I don't know that. Open question time. If you're not, we can have a conversation about that. But most Americans are, and I would say we are right. And let me just tell you why I say most Americans are. And that'll be my number one, what we have to do, which I said, overturn Citizens United. So we've now tested this. Move to Amend, Free Speech for People, lots of groups around the country have tested this theory that Americans will come together to overturn Citizens United, to take back our power, to say, yes, actually, political equality is what this country is all about, and we're going to keep it that way in our lifetime. We've tested it through resolutions all across the country calling for the 28th Amendment, constitutional amendment that will reverse Citizens United, that will say, yes, we the people, through our state and federal legislatures, have the right to enact campaign finance laws that get a handle on this, and that corporations do not have the rights of human beings in our Constitution. So how is that test going? Well, everywhere people get a chance to vote, it passes by huge margins. That's how we know. It's not just the polls that say 79% of Americans want a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, though that's true. We know we can't always count on polls because we see they're not always right. But we can count on ballot initiatives when people actually have a chance to vote. We know the result. So let me give you some examples. 16 states have enacted resolutions calling for the 28th Amendment. 2 of those states were by ballot initiative. The rest were through the legislature. So in Montana, in November 2012, Montana went with Mitt Romney for president. So by all the conventional kind of, what passes for political analysis these days, that's a red state, right? Romney won. Well, on the ballot that day, that very same day, those very same voters had a chance to vote for a Montana ballot initiative that didn't ask for the 28th Amendment, that didn't just say, well, we demand a 28th Amendment. It instructed Montana's representatives to get the 28th Amendment out of Congress to the states for ratification. And not just any amendment. It spelled out the principles of Montana policy were that we need a level playing field, political equality in elections, and better campaign spending limits and campaign contribution limits. And it said corporations are creations of the state. They get the rights and duties under state law. They don't have the rights of human beings in the Constitution. So that was on the ballot in November 2012. They voted for Mitt Romney. They voted for this ballot initiative 75% to 25%. Not even close. Americans do come together on this over and over again. 200 cities and towns have had ballot initiatives now. All have passed. Hasn't lost once. And they're almost always by that margin. Just this last Tuesday, right? And, we had several in Massachusetts, several in Wisconsin, other towns, maybe some of you know, some of the other states, but it was on ballot initiatives, local ballot initiatives. Once again, 70%, 30% passed, not close, passed. Americans know we can fix this. So a constitutional amendment, as I said, this is hard stuff, right? We need 2/3 of Congress to get it out. We need 3/4 of the states. Just a constitutional convention strategy too, that some advocate. But either way, this is hard stuff. But we're doing it. This is how we've done it before. So I have other reforms that I'd be happy to talk about that are also advancing well. But I want to just close with the amendment because I think a lot of this is, yeah, I get the problem, but if we got to do an amendment, we're lost because we can't do that. You know, Congress can't agree when to have lunch, let alone get 2/3 to say we're going to have an amendment. You know, and I want to address that directly because, you know, that was true throughout our history. You know, we've been here before. You think an all-male, unelected Senate, you know, senators used to be appointed. They used to be all-male. And an all-male, unelected Senate voted not once but twice, 2/3 to get women the right to vote with the 19th Amendment and to say we're going to elect senators now. So all our amendments, everything that every advance we've done has been what at the time they would have said, oh, it's impossible, it can't happen. So how do we do it? Well, we do exactly what we're doing now. We don't count on a politician somewhere to ride in and save us. We don't count on a Supreme Court fixing itself. That would all be nice, but we have to do the strategy that the founders gave us, Article 5, the amendment process. And so that's why we're seeing it unfolding across the country in only 36 months, folks. If you think you can't do this, do check out the book because I tell the story of, you know, people who are doing it. You know, maybe some of you have done it. I know Bloomington is one of the towns that have enacted a resolution. It wasn't because the politicians said, oh, let's do this. It's because people like us walked in and said the facts to a city council or to a town meeting or to get a ballot initiative on and said, we have to do this. And they overcame their doubts, their fears, whatever was holding us back to do it. And then they are lifted up by, unlike when you vote, and even when you vote for someone and they win, and then nothing happens or it doesn't get better. When you do this, you see your neighbors, you see people who don't agree with you on politics, agreeing with you on this, and it starts a virtuous circle. That vicious circle not only gets stopped, it turns the other way so that you actually feel like, yeah, maybe we won't succeed, but I'm going to go down fighting. And I'm going to go down with my neighbors and friends and family and my, crazy uncle who disagrees with me on everything else but agrees on this. You start to feel this country isn't as divided. You start to come together as citizens rather than consumers, and we start turning this virtuous circle. And then the next town thinks, oh, that's a good idea. We can try that. Or the state says we can try that, and it works. That's how we got in Congress a vote on the Democracy for All amendment. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. A 28th Amendment was voted. It would have been passed if 55 votes would pass, but that's not enough. But we got 55 senators to co-sponsor the 28th Amendment, had a vote on it, something that people say would never happen. Got through the Judiciary Committee with approval, something people would say would never happen. And in September we had a vote, and we won that vote. We need 67 votes, but that's only 12 more. So this is happening. You can help it happen. We can do this together. And it's not just talk, because we know, I don't think we're worse than our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, who somehow found in themselves the strength and the hope and the vision that we can be better than we are now. And I think I turn to Lincoln, like we all should in dark times, because Abraham Lincoln, of course, presided over the darkest times of America when we almost lost it all, and 700,000 Americans, killed each other over essentially a principle about whether we meant it. Are we all created equal? Do we mean that? Are we going to live for that? Are we going to die for that? And yes, we did. But Abraham Lincoln, a year before the Emancipation Proclamation, called for the 13th Amendment. And his words when calling for it are really interesting. He said, it's not enough to imagine better. We have to do better. He said it's not enough to think anew. We have to act anew. And he said we have to disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. And that was 14 amendments ago, right? 14 of these amendments, I think, these times when we get about as bad as we can and then somehow come out of it, we get out the other side because we don't know exactly how it's going to unfold. We don't know exactly what policy will work. We don't know if we have the strength or the smarts to pull it off. And most importantly, we disenthrall ourselves. And that's where we are. We know nobody else is going to save us. The system isn't working. It's not democracy right now. It's more like plutocracy. We disenthrall ourselves and we act anew and we save our country. So I think that's what we're doing, folks. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to talk and take some questions, but I want to hear from you too. And check out the book, and let's save our country once again. Thank you. So yes, right here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Many of us have read the first book, and I know we're going to read the second one too. I would like your opinion on the fact that if you look around the room this afternoon, you will see basically a certain age group.
Youngsters.
Because we've lived it, we've experienced it, we know what's happening. Can you give some advice on what we can do when we approach and we talk to this younger generations? Because that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah.
But our kids, you know, they do understand, but they're not active. They don't understand that they've got to be active like this. It's okay, you're retired, you have time to do this. No, you always have to make time to do this.
Yeah,
It's
so
nothing to do with being retired. So.
Yeah, you know, I've been asked that several times, and again, like everything else, I don't have a magic answer,
Yeah.
but I've got my best shot at it. And Nancy and I have 3 of those younger. They don't come to my talks either. So, you know, what I think is, number one, we can't tell them what to do. We didn't listen to the older generation when we were their age either, and I think that's just fine, actually. They will figure it out in their own way, and we'll all be better for it. It's sort of my view about, you know, we have a lot of groups doing this, we have different strategies. That's always how we win in the end, is people come to it on their own terms, in their own ways, and find their own ways to act. So I actually get inspired by some younger people. They're doing incredible things in lots of ways, but even if we were to ask them to do it sort of like we did it, or you know, more conventional ways, it's not actually conventional, but it's morally based and determined. It's not a naive hope, it's a determination. So I often think of Kai Newkirk. Anybody heard of Kai Newkirk? Well, I hope you will, because I first met Kai, he's probably 28 years old. He was out at UCLA, came to something at the UCLA Law School there. I next saw Kai on a video from within the Supreme Court argument. Now, as you may know, there's no cameras allowed in the Supreme Court. Yet, there was a camera, hidden camera, and there was Kai Newkirk, dressed better than me. He looked like a lawyer. He had a tie on, and he stood up in the middle of an argument of the Supreme Court. He interrupted the argument, and he stood up and said, "I rise on behalf of the American people who believe money is not speech, corporations are not people, overturn Citizens United," and then he was, the security drags him off. You can watch this on, you can watch this on YouTube. He knew he was going to get arrested. He knew that this was an act of civil disobedience to tell truth to power and to set an example and to spread the word. And he was willing to take the consequences. And it's not just him. He leads a group called 99 Rise, which is about young people rising to not stand silent anymore. He led a march 500 miles from Los Angeles to Sacramento, 400-something miles, demanding that the legislature, California legislature, vote to put on the ballot a constitutional amendment initiative. Exactly what we're trying to do. He said, we're going to walk from LA to Sacramento on the other side of the state, and we're not going to leave until they do it. He not only did the walk and led a lot of other young people with him, they didn't leave until the legislature did it, and the legislature did it. Now, that's another case we're involved in. The court blocked that ballot initiative. But Kai isn't going anywhere, and his group isn't going anywhere. He went on a hunger strike in the weeks before the election day for the principle of one person, one vote, calling on other people to pledge. You don't have to fast, but he pledged to vote for reform candidates who would support a constitutional amendment and the principle of one person, one vote. So there are a lot of young people doing, I think, inspiring things. They don't all have to be like that. So my answer is not usually this long-winded, but it's usually, sometimes I'm asked by young people who do come to the talks, and I think in the end, I say it's up to them. And I think what we can best do is model our own behavior, to not sort of lecture them about what they should do, but try to do it ourselves, and then support younger people when they step up too, because I think they are stepping up in lots of different ways. It's just not the same ways we might do it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes.
I'm curious, the Montana thing's a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
Especially Montana.
Yeah.
With their clear kind of deny climate change because it's economically convenient these days. While we fracked on whole of Montana. What kind of demographics were in the voting pool? Do we know? Was it,
Well, no,
was it a high percentage of voters? Were they mostly
it was
of one ilk or another that voted on this? I mean,
Yeah, well, no, I think it was a presidential year, so it was high turnout. It was 2012,
Okay.
and they voted for Mitt Romney. So
Well,
there,
that we did.
yeah. So there are certainly a lot of Republicans in the voting pool, but you actually see this everywhere. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, his hometown, passed a resolution last Tuesday by a huge margin. So I think, even in places where, whether it's fracking or anything else, I think people recognize, look, I don't agree about, whatever it is, like energy policy or, I may be a Republican, but I know that this isn't right, that billionaires can run the country and corporations have a constitutional veto in the courts, and they will support this. I'm confident in almost any demographic.
I'm rather amazed by it.
Yeah, well, check it out. You can look at unitedforthepeople.org, the number 4, and go click on some of the towns that have done these resolutions, and it says the margin. It doesn't have the breakdown of the demographic, but it's been in red states, blue states, red towns, blue towns, but it's not easy. I mean, that's the thing. If people get a chance to vote on it, you see it. If you try to persuade Republican lawmakers, that's harder, because then you're into the system instead of giving people a voice. Yeah. Well, I must say we have a report at Free Speech for People called Across the Aisle. You can get it on our website, freespeechforpeople.org. It shows 100 Republicans, leaders in the country, who've actually voted for constitutional amendment resolutions. And that's, we're going to continue to try to be as cross-partisan as we can, and sort of create the space for Republicans who want to do the right thing. But, the money is a big problem on both sides. But on that side in particular, I think for the reform, it's difficult for the legislative leaders. And they need to hear it from their own constituents, not necessarily, Nancy Pelosi isn't going to convince Republican congressmen to vote for this, but their constituents might. So we have to reach their constituents through these local organizing efforts. Yes.
One of the things I struggled with this September Senate vote was that what they were voting on, we were sort of led to believe didn't go far enough. We were afraid that it was a more degraded amendment thrust than we really wanted. And it was hard to know, do you go with what you've got? Do you hold back for what you wish for? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So glad you asked that, because I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll try to keep it short.
Okay.
One of the few areas of differences on strategy, or as David Cobb says, David Cobb and I were together in Denver, he says tactics. Not difference on goals, difference in tactics. For Free Speech for People and Move to Amend is just that. So we supported, we helped write, we worked with the Judiciary Committee, the Democracy for All Amendment. And what it did is it said Congress has the power, again, to regulate campaign spending, to ensure political equality, and the states have that right and power, what we've always had in this country until recent years. And number three, that those laws that we make can be different for human beings and corporations in campaign finance spending. Now, move to amend's view is that's not enough because it doesn't say corporations don't have constitutional rights. It only takes on the money and the campaign money, and even though it allows corporate money in elections to be limited or barred, it doesn't say corporations don't have any rights under the Constitution. In our view, my view, we should push for the Democracy for All amendment, and get it, and then push for the next amendment we need. If they come together and we have a chance to get both amendments out of Congress in one, we should take it, push for it. But that won't necessarily happen, and I think if we try to control the exact order, we may lose a historic opportunity. And let me say why I think that. If you look at history, we do these things, there's sort of two views. I think move to amend's view is like, we're going to work so hard, the amendment's got to be perfect.
I know.
But the other view, my view, which I'll try to support with some evidence, is no, what we're doing is creating an amendment moment in American history. We're creating the different alignments, the different alliances, the different, we're kind of disrupting the current system by lifting people up to be self-governing citizens, and then the amendment almost becomes, the final thing. It's not the first thing. So the Senate passed that amendment I talked about, women's right to vote, only because they had to. It was already, the people had already changed the country by that point. So in my view, if we do the work to create an amendment moment, you don't get just one amendment. It's not like one shot and it's over. You create an opportunity for all kinds of reform. So let me show the evidence I said I'd give. Amendments have almost never come with just one. Right? Instead, what happens is the country gets in a hole, Americans come together to lift us out, and we get 3 or 4 amendments at once because it's not just one problem, right? Corporate power is not exactly the same, although it's related to the money problem. And if we had 2 amendments, that may be just fine. So let me show you some examples. The Constitutional Convention came out with the Constitution in 1787 out of Philadelphia, and they thought they were done, and the American people said, no, not good enough. Where's the Bill of Rights? We did 10 amendments to do the Bill of Rights. Only a few years later, 1795, the Supreme Court ruled that bondholders can haul states into federal court. Americans did not like that at all. That was not part of the deal. And we got the 11th Amendment. So there was this sort of ferment around the Revolution where Americans felt like, no, we make the rules. It's a democracy. We make the rules of this country. So that has happened over and over and over again. So after the Civil War, of course, right, it wasn't just one amendment. It wasn't like we had one chance. We abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment guaranteed equality and due process for every citizen. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote. And of course, it wasn't like, oh, you do the amendment and everything's perfect. What it does is give you the power to start working to get there. But we did 3 amendments then. And it wasn't just like in the trauma of the Civil War, the last Gilded Age, right? Much like our own turn of the 19th century into the early 20th century. The Supreme Court was striking down minimum wage laws. They had given railroad corporations and other corporations rights. They were striking down worker safety laws. It was very much like our times today. Great concentrations of wealth and power. There, not much democracy, effectively. So what did we do? We did 4 amendments in 10 years. And of course, that's not all we did, but we created the moment that allowed 4 constitutional amendments. Now, one was prohibition, so we'll put that aside, because that got overturned with another amendment. But think of the others. The Supreme Court struck down the income tax, said that violates the constitutional rights of rich people. Essentially, again, it was like confusing money with democracy. We enacted an income tax, was struck down by the Supreme Court. Constitutional amendment overturned that decision. And that would have been hard to do. They did it. Overturned that decision. Supreme Court said women have no right to vote. Struck down, overturned with a constitutional amendment in that period. The third one was the election of senators that I mentioned, because the system was so corrupted that literally they were passing out bags of cash. A Montana senator, a guy named Clark, even bought his Senate seat, literally, like, you know, gave ranches and bags of cash to state legislators to get himself appointed openly. And it so disgusted the American people, we did a constitutional amendment to say, we're gonna elect senators from now on, we're gonna be in charge of this process. So those 3 amendments in the space of 10 years did it again. In this night between 1961 and 1971, we forget, our lifetime, for some of us, our lifetime, we did 3 amendments, 4 amendments actually, in 10 years. The 3 of them were about this very issue, political equality, representative government. So one amendment overturned the poll tax. This poll tax was being used to prevent African Americans and poor people from being able to vote. The Supreme Court said that's just fine, nothing wrong with that. The American people said, yeah, there is something wrong with that. It violates political equality. We did a constitutional amendment to overturn that. The Supreme Court said young 18, 19, 20-year-olds could be drafted and sent to Vietnam and war. Doesn't violate the Constitution. Constitutional amendment said, yes, it does. And we did a constitutional amendment to give District of Columbia residents who had no representation some representation. So even in our lifetime, we had the ferment of the 60s. It had pros and cons, but it was a democracy moment where it wasn't just like, oh, we'll get one amendment. It's like we need a lot of things to be fixed, and we fixed them. Not everything. And now it's our turn, I think. So I think, from my view, we have to not have like this scarcity attitude of, oh no, we're only going to get one chance. We got to have we are going to do what we're entitled to do and be govern this country as citizens, and we're going to fix what needs fixing. And if we have a chance to overturn not only Citizens United and the Buckley versus Vallejo that says money is just power in voting, we should seize it, overturn it, because that's like exercising our democracy muscle, right? If we get one amendment, it won't be like, oh, that was nice, let's go home. They'll be like, whoa, we know how to do this. Let's do the next one. So that's my answer to that question. How about one more question if there is one, and then I'll be happy to stay around and talk. Yes, Jim?
I have a question. Thank you for your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
For Nancy and for you for visiting us.
Great to be here, thank you.
I have a question about the 5 justices on the Supreme Court who feel so free to dispense constitutional protections to corporations when the issue of corporate personhood has never been argued squarely in the Supreme Court. Forget about 1886. It was a fraud, okay? And this is not just my opinion. This is what Bill Rehnquist said.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because there's no argument for corporate constitutional rights that is not embarrassing. So, and they don't like to be embarrassed, so they kind of hide the ball. I think literally, I'm not kidding. I mean, I did a debate out at in Utah, Salt Lake City, the law school at the university there, and I outlined. I don't have time to do it in answer to this, but I essentially outlined just how absurd it is to say corporations are people or persons under the Constitution. As a lawyer, you cannot honestly get to that answer without just saying, well, we kind of need it to be, or because it would be inconvenient. And that's not good constitutional jurisprudence, right? There's a lot of things we might think, well, it would be better if we did it, but you can't twist the Constitution to do that, even if you thought that, which I don't think so. So instead, they hide the ball, like they did in Citizens United, and they use euphemism. My book, I have sort of a chapter on this technique that they use, and I at the top of the chapter there's a Victor Hugo quote about how metaphor is a thief in the night, and how the abuse of metaphor can do such damage, and that's what they do. So they don't say corporations have rights. They say all speakers have rights, right? They don't say corporations. Literally, they don't actually say the words corporations are people in the Citizens United decision. They just act as if they are, and then apply the law as if it were true. So that's the technique they use, and you're right, Bill Rehnquist, a conservative, when you're talking to conservative folks and they say, oh, this is some lefty thing, tell them to check out the Barry Goldwater conservative from Arizona, Bill Rehnquist, who dissented in all the cases I talk about in this book about when this new version, not back to Santa Clara, but this new corporate rights era we have, he dissented in those cases. He warned that republics fail if we confuse human beings with corporate entities. So you're absolutely right, Jim. There's very, very weak arguments for corporations having rights under the Constitution. But don't let lawyers or law professors or anyone sort of intimidate you about this. It's not like there's some secret magic to constitutional interpretation that we regular people just don't get somehow. No, it's sound constitutional interpretation would not give rights under the Constitution to corporations. Not just because it's wrong as a matter of law, but because it's dangerous. It's exactly the kind of faction that I mentioned with James Madison. It's dangerous to empower entities of the state that are now global. I mean, the money moving through global corporations is bigger than the gross national product of a lot of countries. And to say that they are political citizens just like us is very dangerous in a republic. So Bill Rehnquist got it, other conservatives got it, liberals got it, Americans get it. So I think, I know we're right on that, and I think we're going to change it through the courts and through a constitutional amendment if necessary. So thank you. Oh, you have a question here? One last one.
How do you spell Rehnquist?
Rehnquist, R-E-H-N-Q-U-I-S-T. And just for background, folks, he was the Chief Justice before Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts. And in fact, Citizens United, the only reason it happened is Chief Justice Rehnquist died, and Sandra Day O'Connor, another Arizona conservative, retired. Sandra Day O'Connor had written the McConnell decision that came out the exact opposite way as Citizens United only 6 years before. She retired, replaced by Samuel Alito. Chief Justice Rehnquist died, replaced by Chief Justice Roberts, and we got where we are. So, R-E-H-N-Q-U-I-S-T.
Would it have been better if we had made some of the things approach the legislature rather than approaching the judicial about making these changes, or which would be a better avenue to go to the legislators and tell them that this is what we want, or do we go to the Supreme Court and tell them this is what we want, or do we go to all?
We go everywhere. So Free Speech for People, we have a legal team. We're looking for cases that will go to the Supreme Court, and we'll keep going and going and going until we win. But we cannot leave it to the lawyers anymore. Lawyers have had their chance. We're doing our best, but we will not do this unless we have a national involvement of all the American people. And that's what the constitutional amendment is about. And for that, go to your local leaders, go to your local folks, whether they're in churches and anywhere where people gather, and find a way to put it before the body for discussion. Go to your local legislators, go to your state legislators. So we have to do all of that. So check out Move to Amend and talk to the folks here who are organizing that kind of response, because I think we can't just leave it to a strategy, well, let's get to the Supreme Court and somehow hope they'll come back with a better answer. We actually tried that. One of the reasons Montana was so inflamed about this is Montana had a law that went back 100 years that's kept corporate money out of elections. They defended that law after Citizens United. We helped them defend it. Went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had a chance to fix this, and they slapped Montana down, struck down all the state laws too, and said Citizens United is the law of the land. So this court won't fix Citizens United. There's no sign that we're going to get a better court anytime soon. We have to go to the legislators, we have to go to our local people, and we have to get loud and get organized and push back until we win.
Or you can also write to your Supreme Court Justice. I'll give you his address.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so seriously, share addresses, share ideas, talk about it here, because the best thing, I promise you, the best thing is organizing locally and working with people in your community, because you know who your state reps are, you know what people have done before. We're just more powerful that way, and that's happening across the country, as I said, and you can count on it. I mean, don't feel you're alone. Americans all over the country are doing this. I've seen it. I describe it in the book. People are doing hard work to get this done. So thank you very much. Check out the book. I'll stick around.